the reality genre for the scene, this is the reality leaf. And this is the way in which the world works. How is the story experienced by Sam in terms of the spectrum of reality? So I'm going to have to go to another screen to sort of flesh this out a little bit. But generally, we have four categories of reality. We've got realism, which means that the story could happen. Factualism, a story that did happen, but it's sort of based upon true events, that kind of thing. So the storyteller is using facts to write the story, but it's factualism because it's not pure documentary. Documentary is tricky because is there ever real pure documentary unless it's just like the Zapruder film? Fantasy is alternate reality, right? So it can be fantasy about the past or fantasy about the future. So fantasy about the past would be sort of Hobbit-like stuff, and fantasy about the future would be science fiction. We're thinking about what could happen in the future in science fiction, and there are all kinds of axiomatic things that the author does to create that world, just as what could have happened in the past. Were there magic systems in the past? That sort of thing. That's part of fantasy too, but that's sort of a nostalgic take, whereas the science fiction is utopia or dystopia take of what will happen in the future. So nostalgia for a better past or nostalgia for a grim past, sort of a Hobbesian past or I think it was Rousseauian past, where there was the idealization of the natural world, whereas Hobbes was sort of, it was always dog ate dog and we were all murdering each other all the time. So so the nostalgic fantasy, you can see where all of those things, the science fiction and fantasy category, which has been lumped together, is all about sort of these alternate realities, these simulated realities based upon axiomatic concepts about the future or the past. And then lastly is absurdism. And absurdism is very much akin to, it lives inside of the anti-plot world generally, but specifically absurdism are drop-ins of coincidence that don't make sense. Anyway, I'm going to play on this a little bit longer just to get into what this reality leaf can really break down to. So absurd is, if you did a spectrum, you would sort of have factualism and realism sort of right in the middle. These are the realms of reality that we experience every day. And then you have fantasy, which is alternate reality that is still rule based, right? There's still a lot of rules. And then there's science fiction, which are future rules, right? And then in between realism and fantasy, you kind of have this strange, fun place called magical realism, where the most of the events are in a realistic nature, and then there's magical elements that drop in. 100 Years of Solitude is a good example of magical realism. And lastly, you would have absurdism at the very left side of the spectrum, which would mean that it's very chaotic, right? Complete random uncertainty. And so these are sort of like the gradient of reality genres, right? And these all have senses that go into order, complexity, and chaos. This is a more further delineated concept for StoryGrid 2.0 of the reality genre, and I don't want to belabor it, but I thought it would be interesting to just share anyway. So Tim, let's get back to the reality genre for Ed McBain's story. What did you categorize it as?
Well, I put it as realism mainly because it's a police procedural that is set in, when it was written, it was set in modern day. It could happen. But it's not just factualism, right? It's not telling a story that actually did happen. It's definitely not absurdism, and it doesn't, cast into the fantasy realm. So we don't get into magic or science fiction or anything like that. I said it in realism.
Yeah, I agree that it's realism. I did have something to add on kind of how you can think about the spectrum. We talked about rules and chaos, but a way to boil that down is about how does cause and effect work in the world? Is it a mirror of how it works around us, and it is. He's trying to present something that seems realistic. So that's where we get to realism. And then on the fantasy science fiction side, it's like an extension of cause and effect. So, in the real world, I can only go so fast. In a science fiction world, maybe I can go warp speed. So I like to think of it as taking something that we can do and going to the end of the line, and you get the cause and effect there. And then on the other side, it's a breakdown of cause and effect. So that's how you create randomness, is by breaking that linkage between the causes and the effects. But here in this world, it operates according to the physical and social laws and norms and codes that we experience in our everyday lives.
We have sort of a joke here at StoryGrid 2.0 that each of us has a cape, and Danielle's cape is the green cape, mine's the blue cape, and Leslie's is the red cape. And so what Danielle just did there was show her green cape stripes, I guess, because she was talking about causality, right? And what is the operating feature on the surface is cause and effect and causality. And so she was using a trick to figure out the reality genre by discussing, well, what's the relationship between cause and effect in the story? Is it hyper cause and effect, meaning, you've got warp speed instead of regular speed? Then that would be sort of in the science fiction fantasy realm. Or you can use magic. Fantasy usually has some magical system. And then the breakdown of cause and effect is absurdism. So that's really, really helpful.
Just one quick note about, in terms of the red and how we that realism is the effect we want to create for the single audience member, and so that plays with the style as well. Another way to say effect is, it's as if this is a police report. It's as if this is realism. This is a real world. It's connected to our world, and so that's how I would pull that in.
Yeah, great. So the as if is a very important factor in the red zone, because oftentimes this is a sort of an acting tool too. It's difficult to come up with, like, when you plumb the depths of your soul and you're like, I just don't know how I would behave if it were. But when you add the magical as if, it becomes an easier thing to grip. I'm not sure if I think Evan Hunter, who was Ed McBain was his pen name. I think he was a police officer before he started writing full time. Like Michael Connelly, who writes the Harry Bosch novels, he was a journalist. And so he was around police detectives a lot. And then that's how he was doing the as if, I think. He was pretending as if he were an LAPD cop when he came up with the concept of Harry Bosch. And also, he based it upon Hieronymus Bosch, which, one of the seminal artistic figures in the history of Homo sapiens. And the way he describes how Harry Bosch has to contend with the world. Connolly's a very intelligent person who's very well educated. And so he uses his understanding of perhaps what Hieronymus Bosch was trying to signal to us, which he was very effective at doing it. Just the difficulties of navigating a complex world. He mapped that onto his LAPD detective Harry Bosch. So the as if is an extraordinarily powerful tool for the writer. And then Michael Connelly, who's a journalist, he doesn't have to plumb the depths of his soul. He's melding the cops that he knew on the beat with Hieronymus Bosch, and there you go. So that's a really good tool too, to think about the realism and how to best transmit how real it is from that red zone that Leslie uses to ground her.